خير إن شاء الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد. Of course, our normal tradition is obviously to go through exploring the Quran. But as it's a situation, I think today calls for something a little bit different. Certainly to start off with, and I was talking about, of course, Palestine. The first thing to start off with, we talk about exploring the Quran. And when we explore the Quran, we find that the most repeated story amongst the prophets is the story of Musa alayhi salam. And a question arises then, why Musa? The most often repeated story in the Quran is not the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, nor is it Isa alayhi salam, nor is it the father of the prophets Ibrahim alayhi salam, nor is it the father of mankind Adam alayhi salam, nor is it the second father Nuh alayhi salam. The most repeated story of all of the prophets is Musa alayhi salam. And some of the scholars, they discuss this. And they say, why is the story of Musa alayhi salam the most repeated story in the Quran? And they say that the reason why the story of Musa is the most repeated story is because this is the story of life. The story of Musa is the story that keeps getting repeated, in the world. The characters in the story of Musa alayhi salam is something that is repeated in history. You have the Fir'aun, the tyrannical ruler. You have the Banu Israel of Musa. You have that small batch of people that resist this tyrannical ruler. You have the magicians, those people who make white look like black and black look like white. You have the Mala of Fir'aun. You have, those people that are besides Fir'aun, the people that, egg him on, the Haman, the financial people who are financing this tyrannical ruler, and the Malak that are supporting him. And, when we talk about this story of Musa alayhi salam, which is important for us to talk about now in terms of things that are happening, of course, in terms of what's happening in the world, there's so many benefits that we can take away. Subhanallah, one of the lessons that we learn from the story of Musa alayhi salam is what happened to the magicians. Fir'aun, this tyrannical ruler, first of all, how did Fir'aun go about trying to get rid of Banu Israel? What were some of his tactics? One of the tactics of Fir'aun was propaganda. He would say to his people, to his mala, يريد أن يخرجكم من أرضكم بسحره فماذا تأمرون. They want to take you out of your land with regards to his magic, referring to Musa alayhi salam. Fir'aun's tactic was propaganda. It was propaganda towards the people to say, look at what he wants to do. He wants to take you out of your land. He's a threat to national security. So don't be surprised when the Fara'ina that come after Fir'aun use the same tactic, because this is the tactic of Fir'aun, to use propaganda. Don't be surprised. We also learn the story of Fir'aun that, the soldiers of Fir'aun, when Fir'aun was going to have this battle off with Musa, they came in and they started advertising Yawm al-Zina, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it in the Quran, the day, the big day. And these people would go around telling everybody about the big day, the Yawm al-Zina that's going to be happening. So this idea of media propaganda is nothing that's new. Don't be surprised. But be aware that it exists, and be aware that it's been existing since the time of Fir'aun, and all these tyrannical rulers are doing the same thing. It's not just with Muslims that this story repeats. We see this throughout the East and the West. We even see it in the things that we watch. And everything is based upon this tyrannical ruler, this evil tyrannical ruler. Whether you're watching Harry Potter or Kung Fu Panda or Lord of the Rings, it's these group of people, and there's this tyrannical ruler who, uses his power to take them over. And of course, no doubt, this is something that is happening right now in Palestine. And subhanAllah, one thing that we can benefit from is how the magicians responded. Fir'aun, when Musa alayhi salam, when his sign was clear to the magicians and they believed in Musa, they said, قالوا آمنا برب موسى وهارون. They said, we believe in the Lord, in the master of Musa and Harun. And Fir'aun didn't accept this. Fir'aun said, how can you change sides? He's going to, he says, he's going to cut you up. He's going to crucify you. He's going to punish you because you're on the wrong side now. You're on the wrong side. There is serious consequences for being on the wrong side, for being on the wrong side. And what was the replies of the magicians? How did they reply to Fir'aun, even though their consequences were going to be so massive in the face of this this tyrannical ruler? They said, "La ضير, inna ila rabbina munqalibun." They said, "No problem." They said, "Not an issue. Bring it on, because we're going back to our master." Inna ila rabbina munqalibun. And subhanallah, this reply of the magicians is the same reply that we're seeing today by our brothers and sisters in Gaza. That in the face of this tyrannical rule, in the face of this torture that they're going to be going through, they're still saying la ضير, no problem. Inna ila rabbina munqalibun, because we're going back to our Lord. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to assist our brothers and sisters in Palestine. And that brings us into the question in terms of, okay, so what do we do? What do we do now that we're here far away from Palestine, feeling hopeless that there's nothing that we, nothing that we can do? When it comes to tawakkul, when it comes to relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, always that there's two sides to tawakkul. The first side is, there's a reliance upon Allah, and there's the taking action. There's the taking action. And these two things have to come together for tawakkul to happen. As for just saying, well, I'm going to make dua and inshallah Allah will aid them, that's not the way of the Quran. That's not the way of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm just going to make dua and then khair, inshallah, qadar Allah, may Allah, aid them. Dua is good, but that's not enough. That's not what tawakkul is. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, in tansurullah yansurkum. If you aid Allah, Allah will aid you. I.e., there needs to be some effort from us. I.e., it's not just good enough to say, Allah help them, and that's it, without doing anything. That's number one, is for us to understand in terms of, what is tawakkul? And when does the nasr of Allah come? When does the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come? It's when we make an effort, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aids us as well. And we might be thinking, okay, well, what is it exactly that I can do? And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, he says, "i'malu, فَكُلٌّ مُيَسَّرٌ لِمَا خُلِقَ لَهُ." He says, act. For every single person, it's made easy for him, whatever it is that he can do. I.e., every single person can do something. Every single person has been made easy for him to do something. Meaning that there is always something that we can do, even if we might feel like it's something that's insignificant. But this idea of thinking that things that I do is insignificant is a trap of the shaitan, and is not an Islamic ethos. An Islamic ethos is not thinking that something that I do is insignificant. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he says, لا تحقرن من المعروف شيئا. Do not belittle from doing a deed anything. شيئا, nothing. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, اتقوا النار ولو بشق تمرة. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, beware of the fire, even if it was half a date. And the obvious thing to think in this hadith is, how can you fear the fire in half a date? And of course, the meaning of the hadith is, give charity even if it's with half a date. And the obvious thing to think is, what's half a date going to do? What's half a date? That's not going to fill you up. It's going to do absolutely nothing. We're thinking about it logically speaking. What is half a date? It doesn't make the person fill up. Doesn't, sometimes when you're hungry and you have something little, it makes you even more hungry. What's half a date? What's half a date? But here the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us something. He's teaching us that don't think that it's your responsibility to change the world. Don't think it's your responsibility to think that I can take over and I can, I can help the people of Gaza. I can help the people of Palestine. I can solve the starvation in Somalia. I can, help every single person in the earthquake in Afghanistan, or whatever it is. That's not the point. You're weak. But the point is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he puts you on this test, is to see, what are you going to do in this situation? What is it that you are going to do? Don't think that, whether I pay or not does not make a difference to people of Gaza. That doesn't make a difference. Because your job is to see, what are you going to do? وَلَا تَحْقِرَنَّ مِنَ الْمَعْرُوفِ شَيْئًا. And don't belittle anything at all. And fear Allah, even if with its half a date. So what are some of the things that we can do? What are some of these half a dates that we can do in this dire situation where our brothers and sisters are being slaughtered like animals and being treated like animals for the rest of the world? What is some of the things that we can do? Number one, for example, we can donate. We can donate, and don't think, oh, yeah, what's my £5 going to do? What's my £10 going to do? Donate as much as you can. لا تحقرن من المعروف شيئا واتقوا النار ولو بشق تمرة. And Imam Bukhari brings this hadith, واتقوا النار ولو بشق تمرة, in the chapter of zakat, i.e. in the chapter of giving in charity. The second thing that we can do is, for example, doing everything that we can. So applying pressure on MPs, for example. Muslim Council of Britain have got a nice page with regards to things that we can do in terms of supporting Gaza. And one of the things is emailing our MPs and putting pressure on our MPs. And again, you might think, well, that's not going to do anything. MPs are with Israel and so on and so forth. It's not your job. Your job is not to convince the MPs. Your job is to make the effort. Your job is to make the effort. Whether or not you think the MPs are going to do a job or not doesn't make a difference. The point is that you tried. The point is that you did something. The point is that you tried to apply some sort of pressure. That's all that you can do. You're not going to be asked on Day of Judgment, why didn't you stop Israel bombing Palestine? That's not going to be the question. The question is, what did you do? What did you do? Did you do everything that you can or not? So, for example, applying pressure on MPs and other things, like, for example, some things you can apply. There's already a sample email on there, but even, for example, things like highlighting the international things that are slightly going against, such as white phosphorus and so on and so forth. These are just some thoughts which is important to start with, even though our class is about exploring the Quran, because of the seriousness of the situation that's happening with our brothers and sisters. And of course, that's not to deny or belittle the act of making dua. Dua huwa al-ibadah, as the Prophet ﷺ says, that dua, it is the act of worship. But one has to understand what is dua, and the point of tawakkul is joining action with dua. اعملوا فكل يصنع ما خلق له. Do something, and every single person will be make easy for what he did. So we need to join between making dua for our brothers alongside doing everything that we can possibly do to help our brothers. With that, we'll go on and speak a little bit about our topic today, which is Surah Al-Mudathir. Surah Al-Mudathir, and what's the thing, subhanAllah, this is going to be clarifying exactly what was the point I was making before. Before we start off, let's just introduce Surah Al-Mudathir. There's a very famous hadith, as in Sahih Bukhari, that the Prophet ﷺ says, while I was walking, all of a sudden I heard a voice from the sky. I looked up and saw the same angel who had visited me in the cave of Hira, sitting on a chair between the sky and the earth. I got afraid of him and came back home, and I said, cover me, zammiluni, zammiluni. And then Allah revealed the following verses, which is the verses of Surah Al-Mudathir. يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر وربك فكبر وثيابك فطهر. This narration shows us that Surah Al-Mudathir is one of the first verses to be revealed, alongside Surah Al-Muzammil, which will be the next surah that we cover. And subhanAllah, in Surah Al-Mudathir and Surah Al-Mudathir, two different commands, and these are of course the first commands really after Iqra to the Prophet ﷺ. And both of the verses both of the surahs start off with Ya ayyuhal muzammil, Ya ayyuhal mudaththir. Oh, you who was covered up, you were covered up in terms of that you were scared, in terms of the sight that you saw. In Surah Al-Mudaththir, qum fa'andir, stand and warn. In Surah Al-Muzammil, قم الليل إلا قليلا نصفه أو انقص منه قليلا أو زد عليه ورتل القرآن ترتيلا. In Surah Al-Muzammil, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders the Prophet ﷺ to stand up in terms of prayer. There were two different qiyam. There's two different standings. And both of these verses were some of the first verses to be revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. And subhanAllah, it's the point that I was making in regards to the Palestine issue. One is a standing of action, قم فأنذر. The other is a standing of ibadah, قم الليل إلا قليلا. And both of these things, قم فأنذر, قم الليل إلا قليلا, the standing to action and the standing to worship, is the characteristic of the Prophet ﷺ, is the call of prophethood. It's no good just having قم الليل إلا قليلا. Of course it's good, but that's not the complete picture. That's not everything. Just doing Qiyam al-Layl, just reading Quran, just doing acts of worship. Nor is it good just to be extremely politically active. Qum fa'anzir, doing action, just doing action, and forgetting about all types of acts of worship, and you're not interested. Rather, both of these revelations were the first revelations to start, and both of them come together. The Qum al-Layl representing the act of worship, representing this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, representing dua, representing standing up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of worship. Qum fa'andir, standing up and warning, representing doing something, going out and warning, having some sort of action. And both of these things have to come together for for us to be following in the command of Allah to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and for us to inshallah follow in the footsteps of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Qum fa'andir, stand up and warn. Some of the Mufassirin, they say how this verse was the verse that started off risala, the starting off of the commanding people to come towards the religion of Islam. As for Surah Al-Iqra, it started off the Nabuwwah, it started off the prophethood, but not him being a messenger. So Qum fa'andir highlights now the Prophet ﷺ is being told, actually you actually need to go out and spread this message now. Qum fa'andir. وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, and your Lord magnify, and your Lord magnify. And this is the religion of Islam, essentially, is making our Master Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the center of everything, the most important thing. وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. And subhanAllah, we'll see how this theme of making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the central theme is a one of the main topics of this surah, in terms of making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the center of everything. وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ. You could translate it literally as, and your clothes purify. What's being meant here in terms of clothes? Some of the scholars actually understood literally and said clothes actually means clothes, i.e. Don't have any najasat, don't have any impurities when it comes to your on your clothes, generally speaking, when you come to the prayer. However, it seems to be, and even in the usage of the Arabs, it seems to be broader than that. And actually, with وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, it represents the actions of your actions, basically, the actions that you wear, the actions that you display. And many of the scholars of the past interpret it like this, such as Mujahid, Sha'bi, Qatada, Dhahhak, and others. They said, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ أي طَهِّرْ نَفْسَكَ مِنَ الذُّنُوبِ, i.e. purify yourself from sins. Purify yourselves from sins. Purify yourself because you're going to be starting this great mission. The mission of calling people to the religion of Islam. As I said, this is one of the first revelations after, as is in the hadith of Jabir, that it's one of the first revelations after Surah Iqra. And Jabir himself actually thought this was the first revelation before Iqra, but it seems like that wasn't the case. Now, وَالرُّجْسَ فَهْجُرْ, and in another riwayah, وَالرِّجْسُ فَهْجُرْ, and الرُّجْس وَالرِّجْس, one of them means idols and the other means filth, i.e. keep away from or abandon the idols and abandon filth. Both of these meanings are encompassed in the different qira'at, and in reality they can be understood as the same thing, because ultimately the spiritual filth is worshipping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is worshipping other than Allah Jalla wa ala. And of course, like we said, the whole point of this surah is magnifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and when people are worshipping idols, then of course no doubt that's taking away from the magnificence of Allah Jalla wa ala. وَلَا تَمْنُنْ تَسْتَكْثِرْ, and do not do a favor expecting more in return. The idea here being doing things sincerely with ihsan, not seeking a reward from people when you're doing stuff. Rather, when you're doing something, you're doing it solely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll remind you again, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, magnifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you're doing a deed, to do it sincerely for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't do a favor to someone expecting more in return. وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ, and for your Lord be patient, because these commands aren't easy. This mission is not going to be easy. So one has to be patient, because you're going to be facing hardship in this world. فَإِذَا نُقِرَ فِي النَّاقُورِ, and when the trumpet is blown, we've come across before a nafkh, the blowing in the trumpet, and here a different word for blowing, فَإِذَا نُقِرَ فِي النَّاقُورِ. And some say that the difference between this and nafkh is here there's almost a bit of spit in the blow, like a to emphasize this blowing. فإذا نقر في الناقور فذلك يومئذ يوم عسير على الكافرين غير يسير. And when the trumpet is blown, on that day, it will be a difficult day. It's going to be a difficult day. For the disbelievers, it's not going to be easy. غير يسير. Then Allah Jalla wa Ala, He says, ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا. He says, leave me and the person who I created alone. And here the scholars of Tafsir are almost unanimously agreeing that who's being referred to here is Al-Walid ibn Mughira. Al-Walid ibn Mughira is one of the chiefs of Quraysh. He's one of the biggest people when it comes to Quraysh. He had everything. He had money. He had children. He was one of the most linguistically advanced of all of Quraysh. When it came to Walid ibn Mughira, because he was the best in poetry, they said, look, in terms of this Quran, what is going to be the excuse of the Quran? Because of course the Quran was such an unbelievable a speech that the Quraysh were confused. What are we going to call it? What can we possibly call this? Because it doesn't seem like this is a speech of a man. So they tasked Al-Walid ibn Mughira, who is the head poet of Quraysh and one of the senior people in terms of wealth and children. Have a look in terms of this Quran. What are we going to do about it? And subhanAllah, the narrations even mention that when Walid ibn Mughira heard it, he has some beautiful words describing the Quran, but of course he can't admit that. He can't admit that because he's too arrogant. He's too arrogant to admit that the Prophet ﷺ has come with the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's too arrogant. And remember, رَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ. Fakabbir means, when you're magnifying Allah, when you're putting Him on a high station. And the opposite, of course, is when you have kibr, when you have arrogance. That you see the truth, but you want to avoid it because you're too arrogant to admit it, which was the case of Walid ibn Mughira. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, leave me and who I created alone. I.e. saying to the Prophet ﷺ, as if you say to your friend, don't worry, I got this. This guy, leave him with me. He's mine. He's mine. And of course, this isn't a person speaking. This is Allah Jalla wa Ala. He says, ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا. And He was created alone because ultimately all of us were born with nothing. All of us were born alone. And it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that grants everything that we have. Because then He says, ذَرْنِي وَمَنْ خَلَقْتُ وَحِيدًا وَجَعَلْتُ لَهُ مَالًا مَمْدُودًا وَبَنِينَ شُهُودًا وَمَهَّدْتُ لَهُ تَمْهِيدًا. Allah Jalla wa Ala, He says, and I granted to him extensive wealth. Walid ibn Mughira was very rich. وَبَنِينَ شُهُودًا, and children that were present. Of his children, by the way, was Khalid ibn Walid. And of course, Khalid ibn Walid accepted Islam, but his father didn't. And it was said that Khalid ibn Walid, when he first accepted Islam, this was, he wanted to almost face the difficulty. So, this is one of the surahs that he wanted to almost throw himself in. He found difficulty at the beginning trying to, reading the surah, because obviously this is his father who's being referred to here. But in reality, this can apply to anybody who feels like that they have it, anyone who has this arrogance towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because ultimately Allah grants, all those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted children and wealth. وَمَهَّدْتُ لَهُ تَمْهِيدًا, and I spread for him ease. I gave him an easy life. I gave him a good life. He was of the higher society. ثُمَّ يَطْمَعُ أَنْ أَزِيدُ. Then he desired that I should add more. He wanted more. And of course, such is the state of the human being that, we always want more. No matter how much we have in terms of this dunya, we always want more, which is why it comes to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, if the child of Adam was to have a mountain of gold, he'd want a second, because we always want more. And some of the scholars interpreted it as he wanted more, i.e., when he's hearing about the hereafter from the Prophet ﷺ, they were arrogant to say, well, look, I've been given in this life, imagine what's going to be there for me in the hereafter. He understood to think that because he was blessed in this life, he's going to be blessed in the hereafter. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kalla. Kalla. That isn't the case. That isn't the case. إنه كان, in fact, he was stubborn when it comes to our verses. He was stubborn when it comes to our verses. And again, linking back to this concept at the beginning, وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, magnifying your Lord, the opposite of putting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a glorious place is when you are stubborn and when you are arrogant. سَأُرْهِقُهُ صَعُودًا. I am going to cover him with a laborious punishment. And I guess this really aids the idea that what was being referred to as Tumayt Azid is the idea of that he's going to have more in terms of the hereafter. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, that's not the case. Rather, I'm going to give him punishments, signifying that no, you're not going to be getting, don't think because you've had a good life here, you're going to have a good life in the hereafter. Then it's described as what happened when he heard this Quran. إِنَّهُ فَكَّرَ وَقَدَّرَ فَقُتِلَ كَيْفَ قَدَّرَ ثُمَّ قُتِلَ كَيْفَ قَدَّرَ ثُمَّ نَظَرَ ثُمَّ عَبَسَ وَبَصَرَ فَقَالَ إِنْ هَذَا إِلَّا سِحْرٌ يُؤْثَرُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes his pacing up and down in his thinking. Indeed, he thought and plotted. What am I going to say about this Quran? So may he be destroyed how he plotted. Indeed, may he be destroyed how he plotted. He says, thinking, what am I going to say? What can I possibly say about this Quran? ثُمَّ نَظَرَ, then he looked. Then he frowned and scowled. And then he turned back and he was proud. Again, the idea of pride against the idea of magnifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, in هذا إلا سحر يؤثر. Khalas, this has to be magic then. And when we read about these ayat about Al-Walid al-Mughira, subhanAllah, you might think that, okay, so how is that relevant to me today? And so often people, and you see this a lot in academia, you see this so much in academia, they will bring and think hard about every single excuse to think who was a Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I've even seen academics say he must have had epilepsy because of the narrations when revelation came and it was heavy upon the animal that he was on. Yani they will think forever. They will innahu fakkar wa qaddar. He's going to think and plot. Well, what are we going to say about Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Because we can't say he's a prophet. That's one possibility the academic would never say. The Western academic would never posit. There has to be another explanation. Maybe he was a this, maybe he was a that, maybe. And you'll see they all have different theories about who the Prophet was. Rather than being too arrogant to see the obvious, which is the fact that he was the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, although these verses reveal about Walid al-Mughira, this idea of people just rejecting the truth and just thinking and plotting and thinking, what else could he possibly be? Let me think of every single possibility that he could possibly be, apart from the Prophet of Allah. This happens. And just like Walid al-Mughira did with the Quran, what could this possibly be? Could it be, it's not the speech of a man, that's for sure. Could it be from the jinn? Could it be this? Let's just say it's magic. Because what else can I possibly say? We'll stop there because we've nearly been half an hour. And then inshallah we'll carry on next week. We ask Allah subhanahu to accept from us and to make us from the people of the Quran and to aid our brothers and sisters in Palestine. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.